and welcome to the second video in the series, this time about blended learning. So what is blended learning? Well, typically you probably imagine a blend or a combination of face-to-face and online learning. But that's quite a simple definition. Here at Oxford University Press we believe it goes much deeper than that. So blended learning is about combining the traditional and the modern. Study at school with study at home. Traditional materials with modern digital materials. And studying as a class as well as studying individually or in small groups. All of these combined can create different blends, and that for us is blended learning. Now there are two other things to bear in mind for this definition of blended learning. Firstly, it doesn't have to be a 50-50 split. So if you do some work online with your learners, and maybe it's just an hour every month, and the rest of it is face-to-face, that's still blended learning. Secondly, I think it's important to point out how digital tools and digital content have really pushed forward this whole area. If you compare the availability of materials now to what it was like 10 or 20 years ago, there's really no comparison. Those materials might be online. For example, you only access them when you have an internet connection, or they might be offline, but actually on your computer. So for example, you download the materials onto your laptop. So why does blended learning matter? Well, obviously it gets a lot of coverage at the moment simply because of the amount of digital tools and digital materials that are available. But it's important too because it gives learners a lot of new opportunities. It allows them to personalize or individualize their learning, and that of course is quite motivating. How does it do that? Well, if you think about traditional teaching models with a teacher in a classroom scenario with 20 learners, I think normally we as teachers would teach to the middle of those 20 learners. In other words, we don't consider every individual's specific needs, but we try to teach in a way that helps the whole class. Obviously, you can still continue to teach in that way, but if you combine that or blend it with time learning, which an individual learner can spend, say, studying an area of language which is important for them, then you can see how we can personalize and individualize the learning pathways a bit more. Blended learning, therefore, gives us an opportunity to improve the learning experiences of our learners. Now, there are one or two questions that I often hear related to blended learning. Firstly, perhaps the most common, is when teachers tell me that they don't have the internet. Perhaps they don't have good internet access at their school. Or maybe in some cases it's actually very difficult to access even computers at school. Well, again, I would say blended learning doesn't just have to be about using computers. And it doesn't just have to be about using computers at school. You could ask your learners to study online at home, and you could actually give them different activities to do. Now, if you're asking your learners to do online homework, it is worth checking that they do have internet access. I think in most cases now that will be the case, but it's always good to know so that no learners feel left out. A second comment I often hear is that some teachers don't feel very comfortable using online materials, and I think that's quite understandable. It takes time to get used to using them. But I would suggest that teachers can very easily get used to a blended approach. How could you do that? Well, just by combining your normal classroom teaching with more group work or individual work in lessons. So you could, for example, put learners into small groups and ask them to work on different tasks according to their needs in those groups. One group might do some revision around language, another might do some speaking practice. Now, this does not involve, at this point, any kind of digital materials or connectivity, connection to the internet, but you're blending. You're mixing the traditional classroom teaching with individualized group work. And if you can get used to teaching like this, it will be a lot easier when more and more technology comes into the classroom over the coming years. In fact, if you try this, you'll probably find that some learners working in small groups will start using their phones, perhaps to research something for project work, or perhaps to check an answer. I think this is a great and natural way to begin using blended learning, and it's a very nice situation to be in when the technology starts arriving naturally like that from the learners. Now, I'm going to suggest some practical ideas for you to try in the classroom. If you want more details on these, do download the information sheet for blended learning, where you can find all of these activities plus a few more ideas to use in your class. My first suggestion is actually a tip rather than an activity, and that is to start small. So don't think that you have to start using computers in every lesson, or that you have to give learners homework online every lesson. No, it's a good idea to start with the amount of technology that you feel comfortable with. I think it's a great idea to start small because you'll slowly learn about the differences that a blended approach will make to you as a teacher as well as the learners. For example, if you give learners homework online, that might actually change your normal routine in lessons. Very often teachers check homework at the beginning of each class, and of course if that homework is online and you've already seen what your learners have done, it will change the normal routine. For example, if you're using Oxford English Online for homework, you will see quite a big difference. If your learners do the activities online for homework, they'll quickly get feedback themselves so they can see whether they're right or wrong. You as a teacher will be able to see as well where they've had problems. So that is obviously a great help in the classroom when you want to decide what area of language or what skills to focus on. Now, my next point is that you don't have to only use digital materials online for homework. If you do have computers at your school and you do have a good connection to the internet, you can use them in classes too. In fact, a good idea here, I think, is to use the supplementary online materials, which you can find for most of Oxford's courses. There are different approaches you can use. You can ask the whole group to do the same activity. You can make it a bit more competitive by giving them a time limit. Or you could put them into smaller groups and get them to decide which activities they do. The next idea connected to blended learning is something I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is breaking up your class into smaller groups. Now, I think this works really well, for example, with exam preparation. So you could have 4 or 5 tables in your classroom, and each table represents a different paper of the exam. You can decide, for example, if learners are going to practice speaking and put them on that table, or if they're going to practice writing, for example, put them on that table. Alternatively, they might decide themselves. All of this is really connected strongly to blended learning, even if there's no technology involved. As I say, it's a blend which you could make with a traditional classroom teaching approach, where you're teaching the whole group. And as I also mentioned, you'll probably find if you do put learners into small groups, that they will start to use their own technology to support their learning. It's quite natural for them to do that. So the final point I'm making here is about learners using their own devices. You might have heard of this expression, bring your own device, or BYOD. And it's increasingly common in business and in education, where the learners bring their own technology to the classroom, rather than using technology in the school. And I'm sure if you try that group work approach, you'll see that your own learners start to do that as well. Okay, that's all for blended learning. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it useful, and don't forget to download the information sheet for more ideas.